Hi, welcome back to the next episode of the Keto Naturopath on YouTube. I'm Dr. Karl Goldkamp. Today we're going to go further and deeper in about our research on obesity oil. So that's linolenic acid, that's omega-6. I've showed you about labs you can use. I've showed you the origin of that. But I want to go into perhaps into the slight political but research about how did we miss this? And this research was done nearly 50 years ago. Okay? So burying the truth about obesity oil has kept it a secret until now. The problem, the consequences have been enormous about these two studies for the US and other countries that have used the subsequent nutritional guidelines based on these studies that are still being used today. It begs the question, has it all just been a cover-up to keep this information buried permanently? Was it intentional obfuscation of the original data nearly 50 years ago? Why? Because it didn't fit with the conclusion that they wanted to show you. What are the long-term consequences of having incorrect data on which to base their conclusion that it still exists today? And this may surprise you. So the subsequent guidelines that were based on these recommendations, so the two studies are the Minnesota Coronary Experiment and the Sydney Heart Health Diet. You'll see a lot of references to that. So these guidelines were based on what was either fabricated or simply erroneous conclusions from these two studies. And now they're etched in stone. So it was the McGovern Report in 1977 and the National Cholesterol Education Program in 1985. And let me show you how important they are. You probably think that, well, you're not even born then. Well, maybe you were, maybe you weren't. But these are etched in stone. It's going to take a bomb to blow these particular reports out of the water. And they're still being followed, despite the fact that these two studies have been reviewed, reevaluated, and reconcluded, as we'll see. Okay, here's the guideline of that. Here's when these studies were done, in the 60s, as I referenced. And this is when their data was released. The Sydney Diet Health Study was completed in the mid-70s, pretty much the same year the Minnesota was completed. And they both released their partial data. In other words, they omitted big chunks of the data. But from this, they were so important, their conclusions are so big that the McGovern committee that was put together to make health recommendations settled on these reports saying it's definitive now. These are the things we need to do, and we'll get to that in a second. So when the Sydney Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Experiment were completed, presented, and finally published with only some of the data, both sides, most of the actual data was omitted. And the complete reports didn't come out until 2013 in the case of the Sydney Diet Health, and then 2016 in the case of the Minnesota study. Why was that? Okay, so before we get into that, what were their conclusions to those two studies originally? Conclusion of the original study compared to the conclusion of the new study. Let's go on to the Minnesota. So the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, before and after. So the original study, publication in Atherosclerosis in 1989 is when it finally came out, completed. It had been released at the American Heart Association in the 70s, but this is the formal reporting. So you can find that online, by the way. Okay, so what it showed, it said this. It said the mean serum cholesterol level. Remember, they're all about dropping the cholesterol level to save lives. Right? You take away the saturated fats, you drop the cholesterol, you have fewer heart attacks, and life is good. Well, so they did drop the cholesterol level. The mean serum cholesterol level was an average of 207 for everybody going in. They had a treatment group and a control group, and the treatment group was dropped down to 175. So was that good or not? So for their conclusions were, yes, they dropped the cholesterol serum levels, but there was no differences between the control groups and the treatment groups in terms of death from cardiovascular events, total mortality, and cardiovascular deaths. And there's their particular diagram of that saying, yep, see, it was lower, it's pretty consistently lower, and the net difference was 37. That's going to be important in a second. Okay, then, the conclusion now, based on the re-examined, they got all the data, or this was in somebody's garage, right? this is in somebody's basement, actually. All these magnetic tapes, they had to retranslate, put it back in. So it was a big project. So they put all the data back in together, and what did they come up with? Well, one, there was a 22% higher risk of death for each 30 milligrams per deciliter. So in other words, they dropped down 37 points, and they actually increased the risk for cardiovascular disease and death. Other than that, there was no evidence of benefit, for atherosclerosis, heart attacks in the treatment group. No evidence of benefit. These cholesterol-lowering interventions showed no evidence of benefits on mortality from heart disease. So the Minnesota Coronary Survey results comparison of these two. We have, yes, they dropped the cholesterol. No, there was basically no difference in deaths from any cause, really. And what does it say over here? Yep, dropped to 22%, actually increased the rates of death, risk of death, period, of all cause of death. So dropping your cholesterol increased all cause risk of death. There was no evidence of benefit for atherosclerosis, heart attacks. There was no evidence of benefit from death from heart disease. So that's kind of different. In other words, they put the treatment group into a dangerous situation. What the study adds is substituting omega-6 linolenic acid for saturated fat did not provide the intended benefits, but increased all-cause mortality. Oops. So for 7 years, oops. The all-cause mortality, cardiovascular death, death from coronary heart disease showed no evidence of benefits, and possible risk of cardiovascular disease, given it's part of all-cause mortality, from replacing saturated fat with omega-6. I'm sorry, but did you say replacing saturated fats with omega-6 could possibly increase the risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality? All right, conclusions of the analysis of the recovered data. Replacement of saturated fats with omega-6. Obesity oil effectively lowers serum cholesterol. Check. So basically any polyunsaturated fat will lower cholesterol. The question is it good or not? It's not. But does not lower the risk of death from coronary heart disease or all causes. The analysis of recovered data from the Sydney Diet Heart Study. So basically it was that they said pretty much the same thing, but they were a little bit different. Their study said substituting dietary omega-6 in place of saturated fats increased death from all causes, coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease. So now you have two studies from around the world, completely around the world, done in the late 60s, early 70s, both saying you drop cholesterol, you're going to increase all-cause mortality. And in the Sydney case, it says, no, you're increasing coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality, but specifically heart-related. Okay, so because of the conclusions based on incomplete data of these two studies we just talked about, nationally public health guidelines were erroneously created and etched in stone. I don't know if they'll ever change. The McGovern Report in 1977 and the National Cholesterol Education Program in 1985. So what's that about? The McGovern Report basically set up dietary goals for the United States in 1977. This was like the first of its kind. And this really came out of the 60s, realizing there still actually is severe poverty in the United States, which I do believe that's true today, but it's expressed a little bit differently. Okay, so the question to be asked, therefore, and this is McGovern, the question to be asked, therefore, is not why we should change our diet, but why not? What are the risks associated with eating less meat, less fat, less saturated fat, less cholesterol, less sugar, less salt, more fruit, vegetables, unsaturated fats, and cereal products, especially whole grain. So it's not all bad, but he certainly put less saturated fats and less meat in there and more veggies. That you still see current with the current way of thinking. And so this is him continuing, there are none that can be identified. Important benefits can be expected by dropping these things. The dietary goals created a plan that would increase the intakes of starches, which is whole grains, legumes, root vegetables, green, yellow, non-starchy vegetables. This is taken from the report, by the way. But it will reduce your saturated fats in meat in milk, butter, and cheese. In other words, you'll be eating less you'll be having less milk, butter, and cheese, all dairy products. That obviously never happened, right? And and you have less meat, salt, and simple sugars. So part of that is good of dropping the sugars and so on. So the National Cholesterol Education Program, 1985, has set today what your cholesterol levels are considered good or bad. I mean, I go outside and talk to that next door neighbor about cholesterol all the time, and he's being told he's pre-diabetic. He probably is, but his cholesterol is fine. So this basically set it at, when you see total cholesterol, it's, oh, you need to have it under 200. Oh, geez. Borderline is 200 to 239. So you got an argument there. But if you're concerned about this and you have a doctor and you have the ability to have a discussion with your doctor, you're saying you realize that these guidelines are not just since 1985, which would make it 35 years old. They go back to the early 70s when this research was done. And then you have your LDL. So according to me, my cholesterol is 300, 310. My LDL is 190. We've had this conversation all the time. My HDL is over 100. My trigs are about 50. Okay, lab levels we use today for triglycerides, LDL, HDL, total cholesterol are based on the very incomplete conclusions of these two studies from 1973. Which had a huge amount of missing data in both studies. It showed how out of touch the food industry, U.S. nutritional guidelines, and the various medical associations are, where basic nutrition. These studies completely changed their conclusion of the two studies. These reevaluations, these reexaminations. But were they listening? In case you're thinking, boy, I bet that changed things in the food industry or medical advice, let's look. What I wanted to show you here is online and what you can get complete access to. Let's start here with, there was a couple of articles in the New York Times that covered the discovery of this missing data and saying, wow, that's a big deal. And so you have decades-old study rediscovered challenges advice on saturated fats. You bet it would. Then there's another article in the New York Times. Could have gotten to the Globe or wherever is your favorite paper or whatever. New York Times is not my favorite paper. I'm just saying it's here. A study on fats that doesn't fit the storyline. What do you know? And then even Scientific America covered it as well, saying 40-year-old study raises new questions about fats. So you'd think that would change kind of a medical opinion. Let's go to, but this is Heart UK, a cholesterol charity. And it's basically vilifying saturated fat, saying there are different types of fat in the food we eat. Saturated fats are the type that raise blood cholesterol. And it goes on and on and on. What else do we have? We have, this is the American Family Physicians page. So when you go on here, they talk about saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. And what do they list? Fatty acids and coronary heart disease. What did they list as their reference? 7 country studies done in the late 50s by Ansel Keys that has clearly been, it was bogus. Left out 40 some odd countries. So not only that, that it goes in and again lists that as its top reference. Amazing. What else do we have? Medline Plus, talking about saturated fat. Saturated fat is a type of dietary fat. It is one of the unhealthy fats along with trans fats. They're kind of mixing things here. Yes, they're related, but trans fats are bad. These fats are most often solid at room temperature. Foods like butter, palm, coconut oil, cheese, red meat have high amounts of saturated fats. Too much saturated fat in your diet can lead to heart disease. What else do we have? And this is healthy living. Again, vilifying saturated fats. Eating foods that contain saturated fats raises the level of cholesterol in your blood. High levels of LDL cholesterol in your blood increase your risk of heart disease and stroke. Not true, baby. So I'm just saying, the point of me showing you this is that you would think there'd be a groundswell of let's get into it and find out what's current. No, it basically meant for institutions like Harvard, for instance, I could have gone there. They've really hunkered down to save their $42 billion in endowment to not have their investments bothered. I mean, there's big money behind what's already been established of this research back in the 1960s and early 70s. So I don't see things are going to change. But, however, there is good research coming out. So if you keep your eye on it, you can find out what's relative to you and relevant to you to change. All right, let's go back. Okay, I wanted to finish with going a little deeper on both of those. Both of those studies, the Sydney Diet Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. This is the basis for all of the nutritional guidelines today. And so to know these two studies and how they're so very flawed is to know a lot about our nutritional guidelines and to feel empowered, I hope, that you should do these, think for yourself. You can go back and find these online. You can certainly use my references. But let's dig a little deeper. So what they had, they came out 66 to 73, 68 to 73. They were originally completed 73, completed 73. One was presented at the American Heart Association 75, that's Minnesota. And then the other was only made in presentations and had a report in 1978, but they're both revised. One was in 2013 and the other was in 2016. The interesting thing is in the Sydney Diet Health Study, here's safflower. So when they were serious about using omega-6 for their substitute to say, hey, let's find out about what omega-6 is going to do, they went for the highest source of omega-6, safflower. Maybe it grows a lot in that country. Maybe they use safflower oil a lot. I don't know. But they even called things like safflower margarine. So, but this is what they use. They use safflower oil to increase the omega-6, 78%. And this is basically a little bigger piece of safflower oil, very little saturated fats, some oleic acid, monounsaturated, but 78% omega-6. So the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, they increased their omega-6 from corn oil. How Midwestern, right? That seems kind of appropriate. What can we say about corn oil? Well, it has a lot of pesticides for sure. You can be chewed back then. I don't know if the GMO started back in the 60s or 70s. I'm thinking not, but we know there was a lot of pesticides, and that residue does go forward with the oil. So they were using for primary and secondary prevention for cardiovascular events and death, and for reducing the degree of coronary arterial disease. This is the stretch of oils, and I've presented this a number of times, of course, and I want you to sort of know and not be afraid of, oh, what oil's out there? What should I do? It's all pretty straightforward, but look what they did in Australia. They took the top of the list, 78%. Corn oil, which was used for the Minnesota study, was maybe 60%. So this is all ranked by omega-6 or linoleic acid, and of course the ones in the bottom are highest in saturated fats. There's a little note down here in avocado. It's all over the place. It's hard to find really legitimate, good avocado oil, just like it's hard to find really good, legitimate olive oil. And avocado and olive oil are kind of interchangeable. They're in the same percentage ballpark. You're using those for the monounsaturated, the oleic acid. That's the only reason. But coconut oil, high saturated fats, butter, macadamia oil, cocoa butter is good. Palm oil, most people don't have access to palm oil, real palm oil. Lard, yes, they do. Flaxseed oil is not high in saturated fats, but it's not too terrible in omega-6 either. So I'll leave it at that. I think it's important for you to know. So in the Minnesota study, what they compared was, here you go. They had 39% fat as a control diet. They wanted 39%. They're going to lock it in. That's what they're going to stay at. And they had 38% for the control diet. I'm kind of impressed for the early 70s to have maintained so precise levels over so many years, but that's what they say. So there you go. They just dropped the saturated fat from 18 to 9. They increased the omega-6, polyunsaturated, really 3 times. It was 5%, and they tripled it to 15%. Pretty much everything else stayed the same. The cholesterol level dietary cholesterol level changed because of the fats. And that's what they measured: serum cholesterol, incidence of heart attacks, incidence of sudden death, and all-cause mortality. They were working under the same Ansel Keys perception of replacement of saturated fats with vegetable oils high in linoleic acid. Clearly, they took that line seriously in Australia, right? 78% of linoleic acid for safflower oil would decrease cholesterol. And that part was true. We saw that part was true. And the theory goes it would decrease coronary heart disease. Well, this part was true. increased the saturated fats. Apparently, cholesterol did come down, but that wasn't healthy. They increased all-cause mortality risk. So they were partly right. And here's a man who thought it all and kept it all in play. And this is still the dominant way of thinking in medicine. I kid you not. You go in and they're going to say, oh, your cholesterol's over 200. If you said, where'd you get that number? Oh, well, it's the national guidelines. Where'd that come from? Well, they won't know. But I'm hoping you will know, and you'll be smarter for it. Here again, it's just a list of all those oils. Don't be afraid of them. People don't drink cottonseed oil, but now you'll know. You'll see it in a lot of products. It really comes down to this. It comes down to you eat processed foods, you're going to get foods that are high in omega-6. You have meats and dairy. Dairy is a separate issue. We don't have much of that. But it's saturated fats. I have no problem with saturated fats. Trans fats are an issue. And that goes along with processed foods. You don't find trans fats in whole food sources of protein. Okay, so here were my labs, and this is where, the chickens really come home to roost, so to say. And I'll slide that over a little bit, is that what we see is the upper left-hand corner is I sorted by the highest omega-6 levels and the lowest on the right, and let everything else fall in place. I didn't do all the other panels that I do. There's another 60 tests that people take, but I wanted to line it up and keep it simple. And you've seen this before in previous videos, but it's very important. Let your eye first see, go down to HRP, which is your inflammatory marker, and just go across. Isn't it funny how the highest omega-6 correlated to the highest, for the most part, highest levels of inflammation. And as you go down, it dropped down. Cholesterol level I included, since that 200, right? Less than 200. But notice that those who had the highest omega-6 also had the lowest cholesterol. And yet those who had the lowest omega-6 had the highest cholesterol, but they also had the lowest inflammatory markers. I hope that stuns you. It stuns me. More about fats, just be familiar with this vocabulary. Saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. When people talk about polyunsaturated, you have to ask, is it omega-3 or 6? It's going to be omega-6. Omega-3s is primarily marine mammals, marine animals. And there you go. We've seen this before. Avocado is like olive. Corn is pretty high polyunsaturated. And we'll leave you at that. So you know what to do. We'll talk more next time. Bye-bye.